明开平王，常中武玉春宫，祖宗在上。常氏第21代孙常云辉，携妻张香春，第22代孙女常文兰前来祭拜，望祖宗在天之灵，保佑我华夏长盛不衰，常氏家族一切平安顺利，健康喜乐。
This was my dad praying at our ancestor's grave in Nanjing during Qingming, or Tomb Sweeping Day. It's a tradition in China to honor and pay respects to your ancestors. Our ancestor is the Ming Dynasty general Chang Yuchun. Growing up, I was always told it was an honor to be descended from him, but I never really felt that way, mostly because the family genealogy book only included men. I was born in Beijing but grew up in the UK from the age of 8, and I rejected these very traditional forms of Chinese culture, including the patriarchy. I went to an all-girls school in Richmond, a predominantly white area, and everything I was taught felt opposed to traditional Chinese culture. As a child, that cultural difference never really mattered to me, but as I got older, I felt pressured to assimilate and not be seen as a foreigner. I stopped wanting to associate with my heritage at all, largely because of how Chinese culture and Chinese people, especially women, were portrayed in Western media. Over time, that turned into a kind of cultural insecurity and even political anxiety around being Chinese abroad. Looking back now, it feels like I rejected a part of myself so I wouldn't have to be associated with that image of my culture. So I wanted to return to my birthplace, Beijing, and confront the culture I had distanced myself from during all my years in the UK, in an attempt to better understand my identity and reconcile with my heritage. I began my journey in the old city of Beijing, in Nanluo Guxiang. Locals were offering rickshaw rides through the surrounding hutongs, which are narrow alleyways lined with courtyard houses.
我给你讲讲啊，南锣鼓巷啊，全长是786米，最早它叫锣鼓巷，它是中间高两头低，像个驼背的，左8条右8条，都是对称的。这是故宫的后门，皇城根的脚印啊。这是你们女孩子住在闺房的门。过去的千金小姐大门不能出，二门不能迈，就这种的啊。这两边2个花苞，一个含苞待放，他家里有待嫁的姑娘。等姑娘出嫁了之后呢，这2个花苞要拆掉的，做一个平等四方的，意思呢平平安安出嫁了。现在家里面有待嫁的姑娘了，就是啊。
This was my first real interaction with old Beijing culture, and honestly, it felt a lot like the stereotypes Western people have about traditional Chinese women. That portrayal of East Asian femininity as fragile and delicate that I couldn't stand growing up. My tour guide was also surprised by how little I knew about Beijing history and culture.
您老家哪儿？
我
是台湾。
我是华人。
华人。
对，我在英国。
哦。
Even though it was a friendly conversation, I felt a distance between us after I told him I grew up overseas. Because I was often viewed as foreign in the UK, being seen as an outsider by local Chinese people was a strange feeling. It was the direct result of rejecting so much of my own heritage, yet it still felt alienating. Although I struggled to connect with the cultural aspects, I was really drawn to the beauty of the historic buildings and relics I saw on the tour. And there was one place in particular that caught my attention. It was a dim Qing Dynasty compound, slowly rotting with time. It felt like the remnant of an old society. One of the residents told me it had once been a brothel in the late Qing. As I was about to leave, an old man living there noticed my interest and asked if I wanted to go on a trip around Beijing. I sat on the back of his motorbike and we drove into the city.
在英国待几年啊？
我一共待了10年吧。
英国啊？
对，
哦。男朋友没在你上那边来过？你男朋友没带你上这来？还没交呢。
哦，对，是。
你肯定能找。有钱全找漂亮的女人。那个大学生，他在英国上的。
The whole conversation felt too banal to be true. I realized this was one of the reasons I found it difficult to accept Chinese culture after living in the West, because the age hierarchy allows for a bluntness that can sometimes border on crudeness. I laughed along at the time because, in China, before he's a stranger, he's my elder. The next day I continued wandering around the old city, in hopes of finding something positive that could change my initial impressions from the first 2 days. I found a man selling sugar figurines, a street snack made by blowing air into molten sugar and shaping it into different forms. It was one of the few things I still remembered from childhood in China. It sparked a sense of nostalgia, and I approached him to buy one.
能问一下，您是一直做这个的吗？
我干这个干40多年了，我以前在我老家，我不到20岁就会干这个。小时候农村呢都总结全乡的都干这个都多得很，现在没有了，农村里都没有了，都跑到大城市来了，农村里都养活不了了。
哦，没有人买。
那没法生存了，它不是没法没人买，价格卖不上，在城里卖，不都城里都卖贵些嘛，旅游的人多。
现在还有人学吗？
因为现在年轻人学这个也少了，因为年轻人学这个呢，养家糊口都不行，以后这个慢慢的都没人干了。30年以后，像我们这一块人下去了就少了，有也是年轻人都少了。
Hearing his story, I really respected how grounded he was, despite how little attention his work received. Ironically, if I had encountered this craft in London, I probably would have seen it as creative and original. But I had assimilated into Western ideologies so much that I dismissed these local folk arts as unsophisticated and rustic. I realized that people like me were probably part of the reason crafts like this were disappearing. Before, I carried a lot of internalized shame about my ethnicity, but now I'm more ashamed that I chose to belittle and hide my own culture instead of supporting it. I wanted to meet another craftsman, and in Maor Hutong, I came across a small shop selling snuff bottles, which are tiny containers painted from the inside and used to hold traditional herbal medicine.
几尾小鱼，在自由自在的这个游。前面画了一个花瓣，为什么呢？就是它起到一个视觉的牵引，就是咱们有一些就是看画啊，就是看一些它动态啊，包括它这个视觉的这种流畅度，它这整个的画从这个鱼过来，然后到这儿，它最后还停留在这个主题上。我呢是从98年、99年那一块儿，现在到现在也算是小30年了，28年。
现在还有人画吗？
现在学这个人少啊，几乎是没有了，因为现在一个是，节奏比较快，很多东西都是碎片化，很难有大量的时间去专攻一个东西。这个东西确实是需要大量的时间投身到这个上面去的。
I bought one of his works, a bottle painted with an orchid in a quintessentially Chinese style. I asked if he could paint my name inside the bottle. As someone who also wants to work in art, I really admired his dedication to the craft and the care with which he carried his heritage. He had a certainty in who he was and his place within his culture that I was almost envious of. The artistry and expertise also felt very different from the portrayals of Chinese culture I grew up seeing in the West, which more often than not felt gaudy, caricatured, and exoticized. I found it fitting that it was art that finally made me see a truer image of Chinese culture. I stayed and watched him work for a long time afterwards. An additional place I visited was Wenlange in Hangzhou. It's an ancient library that I was named after. The place had a sense of peace and tranquility, the kind of cultural purity I could never find while trying to assimilate into a Western environment. It reminded me of who I am and where I came from. It reminded me that no matter how much I avoided or suppressed my heritage, I never truly wanted to erase it or replace my Chinese name with an English one. I may have once viewed Chinese culture through a narrow and biased lens, but it's clear to me now that whatever I left behind through immigration remains an inseparable part of me.